I was still wearing the black dress my husband once said made me look steady as Sunday morning when his daughter stood in the middle of his memorial and called me a liar. In front of the pastor, in front of his old friends, in front of half the town that had come to say goodbye to Richard Lawson. She said I had twisted his final days, lied about his love, and stolen a place that never belonged to me. I could barely breathe. And just when I thought grief had done the worst it could do, Pastor Samuel Brooks looked straight at me and said, "Connie." Richard knew this might happen. If you've ever been judged in the middle of your pain, I think this story will stay with you. Please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. And before we go on, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Sometimes it helps to know we're not carrying hard things alone. I suppose if you had only seen that moment in the church, you would have believed her. That's the part that stayed with me long after the shock wore off, not just what Melissa said, but how easily people's eyes shifted when she said it. As if a few well-placed words could rewrite 11 years of my life. As if grief made truth negotiable. So maybe I should tell you who I am before anyone else tells you differently. My name is Connie Lawson. I'm 61 years old, and for most of my life, I was a middle school librarian in Greenville, North Carolina. Not the kind of job that puts you in the center of anything. I spent my days helping children find books they didn't know they needed yet. I liked quiet. I liked order. I liked knowing where things belonged. I didn't expect to fall in love again after 50, and I certainly didn't expect to fight for the right to be remembered as someone's wife. I met Richard Lawson on a rainy Thursday evening at a community fundraiser for the public library. They had set up folding tables and coffee urns that sputtered more than they poured. I was in charge of organizing donated books, sorting them into neat categories the way I always did. Fiction here, history, their children's books in bright, hopeful stacks. He walked up holding a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird like it was something fragile. "Where does this go?" he asked. I remember smiling at him because he didn't look like a man who needed help finding anything. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with that quiet confidence people trust without asking questions. "Depends," I said. "Are you giving it away or trying to take it home?" He laughed softly. That was Richard. Not loud, not flashy, but warm in a way that made you feel seen without effort. I learned later he had been a contractor for most of his life, owned a small but respected construction business in town. Widowed for nearly 8 years by the time I met him. His first wife, Elaine, had died after a long illness. He didn't talk about it often, but when he did, it was with a kind of steady sadness that never quite left him. We didn't fall in love all at once. We met again at another event, then at a diner on Main Street where the coffee was always too strong. Then walks in the park where he'd point out houses he'd helped build like a man quietly proud of the life he'd shaped for others. It was simple. And at our age, simple feels like a miracle. The first time he held my hand, it wasn't dramatic. It was just natural. Like we had both been waiting a long time for something gentle. But there was always one shadow. Melissa. Richard told me about his daughter early on. She's strong, he said. Independent. Knows what she wants. At the time, that sounded like something to admire. I didn't meet her until months later at a Sunday dinner Richard insisted on hosting. I remember standing in his kitchen smoothing my blouse more times than I needed to, feeling like a teenager again. I wanted to make a good impression. I wanted her to see that I wasn't there to replace anything or anyone. When she walked in, she looked exactly like the kind of woman who had never needed to ask for space in a room. Tall, composed, perfectly dressed in a way that didn't look accidental. Her smile came quickly, but it didn't stay long. "So you're Connie," she said, extending her hand. "I am." I answered, trying to match her confidence. Her grip was firm. Controlled. Dad's told me about you. Something in the way she said it made me pause. Not rude, not warm either, just measured. Dinner went smoothly on the surface. We talked about work, about the town, about nothing that mattered too much. Melissa laughed in the right places, asked the right questions, played the role of a polite daughter meeting her father's companion. But every so often I caught her watching me, not curious, assessing. It's a strange thing realizing you are being evaluated not for who you are, but for how long you might last. After she left that night, I asked Richard gently, "Do you think she's okay with this, with us?" He hesitated. Just for a second. "She'll come around," he said, and because I cared about him, I chose to believe that. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony. Nothing elaborate, just a few close friends, a quiet exchange of vows, and a sense that we had both found something steady at a stage of life where most people expect things to wind down. Melissa attended. She smiled for the photos, stood close enough to look like she belonged. But when it was time to toast, her words were, "Careful." "I hope this makes you happy, Dad," she said, lifting her glass. "That's what matters." It sounded kind, but it didn't feel like a blessing. Over the years, I learned how to read the spaces between Melissa's words. She never argued outright, never raised her voice, but she had a way of shaping conversations so that I always felt slightly out of place, like I had stepped into a story that wasn't mine to finish. At holidays, she would talk about family traditions that existed long before I arrived. At gatherings, she would introduce me as Dad's wife instead of using my name. Small things, the kind that don't leave bruises you can show anyone. Richard noticed more than he let on, I think. But he hated conflict. He believed deeply that time and patience could smooth over most things. "Melissa's just adjusting," he would say. So I adjusted too. I stepped back when I felt tension. I softened my words. I tried not to take things personally, even when they felt personal, because loving Richard meant protecting his peace. And for a long time, I told myself that was enough. But there were moments, quiet ones, that stayed with me. Like the Christmas Melissa rearranged the seating so she sat beside him, placing me across the table as if distance could redefine closeness. Or the time she corrected me in front of others when I mentioned something about Richard's business, saying, "That's not really how it works," with a smile that made it sound helpful. Or the way she would sometimes speak to him in a tone that wasn't quite disrespectful but carried an expectation, like his life, his decisions were extensions of something she believed she had a claim to. I didn't have the words for it then, but looking back now, I understand. It wasn't just that Melissa didn't accept me. It was that she never believed I had the right to be there in the first place. And Richard, he stood between us, trying to keep the peace, trying to love us both without choosing sides. I used to think that was kindness. Now I know it was something else too. Avoidance has a cost, and sometimes the bill comes due long after the person who delayed it is gone. I didn't realize then how much history I was walking into, how many things had already been set in motion long before that day in the church. I only knew that I loved my husband, and that I believed, maybe naively, that love would be enough to hold a family together. I didn't yet understand that some people don't see love as something to share. They see it as something to own. Looking back now, I think the first real shift didn't come with words. It came with silence. Richard had always been a steady man. Even when life tested him, losing Elaine, building his business from the ground up, carrying responsibilities most people never saw, he remained grounded. He didn't complain much. Didn't dramatize pain. If something was wrong, he handled it quietly and kept moving. But about 1.5 years before he died, something changed. It started small. He grew tired more easily, the kind of tired that didn't go away with a good night's sleep. Then came the doctor visits routine at first, then more frequent. Blood tests, scans, long conversations behind closed doors that ended with polite smiles and vague reassurances. Until one afternoon, the doctor stopped smiling. I was sitting beside Richard in that sterile exam room holding my purse too tightly in my lap when we heard the words that would redraw the rest of our lives. "It's serious," the doctor said gently. "I don't remember the exact medical terms anymore. What I remember is the weight of them, the way Richard's hand found mine under the table and squeezed not out of fear, but as if to steady me." On the drive home, neither of us spoke much. Finally, he said, "Well, I guess we make the most of the time we've got." That was Richard. Practical, grounded, quietly brave. From that point on, our lives narrowed in a way I hadn't expected. The days became structured around medications, appointments, and careful routines. I learned how to read prescription labels better than I ever read novels. I set alarms for everything: pills, meals, rest. I kept a notebook tracking symptoms changes, anything that might help us stay one step ahead of something we both knew we couldn't outrun. At night, I would listen to his breathing. Sometimes it was steady, sometimes uneven. On the harder nights, I stayed awake longer than I admitted just to make sure he didn't need anything. Those are the parts people don't see when they talk about love. Not the weddings or the photographs, but the quiet tending, the ordinary devotion. I didn't do it out of obligation. I did it because he was my husband, and because in those months, loving him meant showing up in ways that had nothing to do with being seen. Melissa began visiting more often once the seriousness of his condition became clear. At first, I thought that was a good thing. A daughter should be there for her father. But the way she showed up, it didn't feel like what I expected. She would arrive with purpose, always dressed well, always composed. She'd kiss Richard on the cheek, ask him how he was feeling, and listen just long enough to nod. Then, almost inevitably, the conversation would shift. "Have you thought about organizing things a little?" she asked one afternoon, sitting at the edge of his bed like she was discussing a minor inconvenience. "What kind of things?" Richard replied, his voice calm. "You know, accounts, paperwork, the business. Just so everything's easier later." I was in the kitchen at the time, but the house was quiet enough that I could hear every word. Richard didn't answer right away. "We've got time," he said finally. Melissa smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's just smarter to handle it now while everything's clear." Everything's clear. The phrase sat wrong with me, though I couldn't fully explain why. Later that evening, when she had left, I asked Richard gently, "Does that bother you?" He leaned back in his chair, looking more tired than he had that morning. "She worries," he said. But there was something else in his tone, something he didn't finish saying. Over the next few months, those conversations became more frequent. Melissa asking about access to certain accounts. Melissa suggesting ways to simplify ownership of the house. Melissa using words like efficiency and planning that sounded reasonable on the surface but felt pointed. I started noticing patterns. She rarely asked how he felt unless it led into something else. She didn't linger in the quiet moments. She didn't sit with him the way illness requires you to sit with patience, with presence, with no agenda. Instead, she moved through the house like she was mapping it, taking mental notes. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Families are complicated. People show care in different ways. But something in me stayed unsettled, and I wasn't the only one. One night after Melissa had left following a particularly tense visit, Richard called me into the living room. "Sit with me a minute," he said. I sat beside him on the couch, the same place where we had spent countless evenings watching television we barely paid attention to. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. "Connie, if something happens to me," he began. "Richard," I interrupted softly. "We don't have to." "No," he said, not harshly but firmly. "We do." I swallowed and nodded. He took a slow breath. "If something happens, I need you to promise me something." "What is it?" He hesitated again, choosing his words with care. "Will you tell the truth?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "Of course I will," I said. "Why wouldn't I?" He didn't answer right away. "Even if it's uncomfortable," he continued. "Even if people don't want to hear it. Even if it makes things harder." A quiet chill moved through me. "Richard, what are you worried about?" He looked down at his hands. "I just don't want things rewritten," he said slowly. "I don't want the end of my life to turn into something it wasn't." I reached for his hand. "That won't happen," I told him. "I was there. I know what these months have been." He squeezed my fingers gently. "I know you do," he said. Then he added something that stayed with me long after that night. "But not everyone sees things the same way when they think they have something to gain." I didn't press him further. Part of me didn't want to, because asking more questions would mean accepting that there was something real behind his concern, and I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I did what I had been doing all along. I focused on the present, on his care, on his comfort, on the small, fragile moments we still had. But after that conversation, I began to watch more closely. I noticed how Melissa's tone shifted when she thought Richard was being too vague. I noticed the way she sometimes spoke about responsibility as if it were something she was entitled to inherit. I noticed the impatience behind her calm, and I noticed something else. Richard was watching her too, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of quiet clarity, the kind that comes when someone you love begins to show you who they are, and you can no longer pretend you don't see it. That was the hardest part. Not the illness, not the exhaustion, but realizing that as Richard's body weakened, something else was coming into focus, something neither of us had wanted to confront before. And somewhere deep inside me, a thought began to form, a thought I tried to push away. What if the real battle hadn't even started yet? What if everything we were living through was only the beginning? If there was a moment when everything stopped being something I could explain away, it happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The kind of afternoon where the house feels too still. Richard had gone to lie down after lunch. The medications made him drowsy, and I had learned not to disturb those rare stretches of rest. I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes, letting the rhythm of warm water and ceramic calm my thoughts. That's when I heard Melissa's voice. Low. Controlled. Urgent. I froze without meaning to. The house carried sound in a way that made it impossible not to hear what came next. "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable, Dad," she said. "I'm asking you to be practical." There was a pause. Then Richard's voice, softer than usual but steady. "Practical for who?" "For everyone," she replied quickly. "For me, for Sophie, for the business, for what happens after." I stepped closer to the hallway, my heart beginning to beat faster, not out of fear exactly, but because something in her tone felt different. Not polite, not measured, intentional. "I've already handled what needs to be handled," Richard said. "That's exactly what worries me," Melissa answered. "You've handled it quietly, without oversight." Oversight? The word landed heavier than it should have. I don't need oversight, Richard said, a faint edge slipping into his voice. I'm still perfectly capable of making my own decisions. Of course you are, Melissa said quickly, but there was a subtle shift, something almost rehearsed. But people can influence you, Dad, especially when you're not feeling your best. My stomach tightened. People? She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. I know exactly what I'm doing, Richard replied. And I'm sure you believe that she said her tone still smooth, still controlled. But wouldn't it make sense to transfer certain things now, just to avoid confusion later? What things, he asked. The house. The business structure. Access to your accounts. No, Richard said. It wasn't loud, but it was final. Silence followed. Then Melissa spoke again, slower this time. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm making it clear, he answered. And what about me? She pressed. Do I not matter in this? You matter, Richard said. But that doesn't mean you get to decide everything. I realized I was gripping the edge of the doorway so tightly my fingers hurt. This wasn't a conversation about planning. This was something else. Something that had been building long before I heard it. I'm trying to help you, Melissa insisted. No, Richard said quietly. You're trying to manage me. Another silence. Longer this time. Then I heard the faint sound of movement, her chair shifting perhaps, or her standing up. You're being influenced, she said finally. The words came out sharper now, less polished. By who, Richard asked. She didn't answer right away, but when she did, her voice dropped just enough that it felt like something meant to be controlled, not heard. You know exactly who. That was the moment I stepped back, not because I wanted to avoid it, but because something inside me understood I wasn't meant to be part of that conversation. Not yet. A few minutes later, Melissa walked out of the office and down the hall. When she saw me in the kitchen, she smiled, the same composed, perfectly measured smile she had always worn. Is he resting? She asked. Yes, I replied, keeping my voice even. Good, she said. He needs it. She picked up her bag. I'll come by later this week, she added. There are still a few things we should probably go over. Of course, I said. She paused at the door, then looked at me, not with hostility, not with open disdain, but with something colder, evaluative, like she was recalculating. And then she left. The house felt different after that, heavier. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment before finally walking toward Richard's office. He was still sitting in his chair, though he looked more tired than before. Hey, I said gently. He looked up, offering a small familiar smile. Hey yourself. I hesitated. I didn't mean to overhear, I said. You didn't, he replied. She meant for it to be heard. That surprised me. What do you mean? He leaned back slowly, exhaling. Melissa doesn't raise her voice unless she wants someone to notice, he said. I sat down across from him. She's worried, I offered carefully. Maybe she just... No, he interrupted softly. Connie, she's not worried about me. The certainty in his voice made my chest tighten. Then what is she worried about? He looked at me for a long moment as if deciding how much to say. Control, he answered. The words settled between us. I've helped her a lot over the years, he continued, more than I probably should have. I stayed quiet, letting him speak. There were business ventures that didn't go the way she planned, he said, investments that fell through, situations she didn't tell anyone else about. You helped her through them, I asked. He nodded, more than once, and no one else knows. Not in full, he said. I made sure of that. There was no bitterness in his tone, just weariness. I thought I was protecting her, he went on, giving her time to figure things out, to grow into herself. And now I asked gently. He gave a small, sad smile. Now I think I might have taught her that there would always be a safety net. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not even resentment, but a clearer understanding of something I had only sensed before. This isn't about me, is it? I said quietly. He shook his head. No, he said. It's not. But then he added almost as an afterthought. That doesn't mean you won't be pulled into it. A chill moved through me. What do you mean? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a folder on his desk, one I hadn't noticed before, and rested his hand on it. I need to start putting things in order, he said. You already have, I replied. We've talked about this, your will, the accounts. That's not enough, he said. Something in his voice had changed. Not fear, resolve. There are things that need to be clarified, he continued. Documented properly, so no one can twist them later. The words echoed something he had said before, about the truth, about things being rewritten. Richard, I said softly, are you expecting a fight? He met my eyes. I'm expecting confusion, he said carefully. And confusion, he added after a pause, has a way of turning into something else when people feel entitled. Entitled. Another word that landed heavier than it should have. I swallowed. What do you want me to do? He reached across the desk and took my hand. For now, he said, just stay with me. It sounded simple, but I understood what he meant. Stay steady, stay present, stay true, even when things got harder. And somehow in that quiet room with the late afternoon light stretching across the floor and the weight of things neither of us fully said, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't just about illness anymore. This wasn't just about time running out. There was something else unfolding beneath it all, something that had been building long before that afternoon, something that would not end quietly. And for the first time, I began to understand why Richard had asked me that question. Not whether I loved him, but whether I would tell the truth, even when no one wanted to hear it. After that afternoon, something shifted in the way I saw everything. Not dramatically, not all at once, but like a lens slowly coming into focus. I began to notice things I might have dismissed before. The way Richard moved more deliberately through his paperwork, the way he closed his office door when making certain calls, the way he paused before answering Melissa as if measuring not just his words, but the consequences of them. And then there were the meetings. The first time he mentioned seeing Margaret Ellis, he said it casually. I've got an appointment in town tomorrow, he told me over breakfast, stirring his coffee with more attention than necessary. What for? I asked. Just some paperwork, he said. I nodded, not thinking much of it at the time. But when he came home that afternoon, there was something different about him. Not lighter, not heavier, just settled. As if a decision had been made. Everything okay? I asked. Yes, he said simply. Everything's getting where it needs to be. That became his phrase. Where it needs to be. A few days later, he mentioned Pastor Samuel Brooks. I asked Samuel to stop by later this week, he said. For prayer, I asked. That too, he replied, but there was a faint hint of something else behind it. Pastor Brooks had been part of Richard's life long before I came into it. He had officiated Richard's first marriage, counseled him after Elaine passed, and remained a steady presence in the background of his life. When Pastor Brooks arrived, I greeted him warmly and offered coffee, but Richard asked if they could speak privately. I didn't question it. People nearing the end of life often have things they want to say to a pastor that don't belong in the open. Still, I noticed how long the conversation lasted. Longer than a prayer, longer than a simple visit. When Pastor Brooks left, he shook my hand gently and said, "You're taking very good care of him." "Thank you," I replied. Then he added, "He knows that." Something in the way he said it lingered with me, as if there was more he could have said but chose not to. Around the same time, Richard reached out to Aaron Mitchell. That surprised me. Aaron had been Richard's business manager years ago, back when the company was growing fast. They had worked closely together for nearly a decade before parting ways, not on bad terms, just different directions. "Why Aaron?" I asked one evening. Richard shrugged lightly. "He knows the books better than anyone ever did. You're worried about the business I pressed. I'm making sure everything's clean," he said. Clean. Another word that carried more weight than it seemed. Aaron came by the following week. I recognized him immediately, taller than I remembered, a little more gray at the temples, but with the same straightforward presence. He greeted me kindly, then spent hours with Richard in the office. Hours. When he left, he looked thoughtful, not alarmed, but alert. "You've got a good man there," he said to me as he stepped out the door. "I know," I answered. He nodded once like he was confirming something to himself, and then he was gone. That night, I found Richard sitting quietly in the living room, the television on, but muted. "Long day," I said, sitting beside him. "Productive," he replied. I hesitated. "You've been doing a lot of that lately," I said carefully. "Meetings, calls, things you're not really explaining." He turned to me, his expression soft but serious. "I know," he said. "It's just—" I struggled for the right words. "I don't want to feel like I'm on the outside of something important." The words hung in the air between us. He reached for my hand. "You're not on the outside," he said gently. "Then why does it feel like it?" I asked. He took a slow breath. "Because some of this," he said, "needs to be handled in a way that doesn't pull you into it before it has to." That didn't fully comfort me, but it did tell me something important. Whatever he was doing, he believed it would eventually involve me. Just not yet. Meanwhile, Melissa's behavior continued to shift in ways that were harder to ignore. At first, it had been subtle questions, suggestions, the occasional pointed comment. Now it felt more deliberate. One afternoon, Diane Harper came over for tea. Diane had been my closest friend for years, the kind of friend who didn't need long explanations to understand what you were feeling. She listened quietly as I told her about the conversations, the meetings, the growing tension. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me. "Connie," she said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "All right," I said. "Do you think Melissa is preparing for something?" The question landed exactly where my own thoughts had been circling. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe. It just feels like she's positioning herself." Diane nodded slowly. "That's what I was afraid you'd say." "You've noticed something too?" I asked. She gave a small knowing look. "I ran into her at the grocery store last week," she said. "We made polite conversation. But she mentioned you." My stomach tightened. "What did she say?" "Nothing outright," Diane replied. "But enough." "Enough what?" "Enough to plant a seed," she said. I felt a chill. What kind of seed? Diane hesitated for a moment as if deciding how directly to say it. She suggested that Richard hasn't been himself lately, she said carefully, that he's been influenced. The word hit me like a quiet blow. Influenced, I repeated. Diane nodded. She didn't accuse you directly, she added, but she didn't have to. I stared down at my hands. She's setting something up, I said slowly. Diane didn't argue. She's shaping how people see things, she said, so when the time comes, they're already leaning in her direction. A heaviness settled over me. Not panic, not yet, but a deep growing unease. What am I supposed to do? I asked. Diane reached across the table and took my hand. For now, she said, pay attention. That was all. No dramatic advice, no call to action, just awareness. And somehow that felt more serious than anything else she could have said. Over the next few weeks, I did exactly that. I paid attention to the way Melissa spoke about Richard in front of others, always careful, always reasonable, but with a subtle thread of concern woven through her words. To the way she referred to decisions as if they should involve her more than they already did. To the way she began showing up with questions already formed as if she expected certain answers. And I paid attention to Richard. To the quiet determination in the way he handled things. To the fact that he never confronted Melissa directly in anger, but also never gave her what she was asking for. And to the growing sense that something was being built behind the scenes. Something structured. Something intentional. One evening, as I helped him sort through a small stack of documents, I couldn't hold back anymore. Richard. I said, what exactly are you preparing for? He looked at me for a long moment. Then he gave an answer that stayed with me long after that night. I'm not preparing for what will happen while I'm here, he said. I'm preparing for what happens after I'm gone. The room felt suddenly smaller. And you think it's going to be difficult? I asked. He held my gaze. I think it's going to be confusing, he said again. Then more quietly, and I don't want confusion to be used against you, against me. That was the first time he had said it so clearly. I felt my throat tighten. Why would anyone use anything against me, I asked, even though part of me already knew the answer. He didn't say Melissa's name. He didn't need to, because he said gently, it's easier to question someone who wasn't there from the beginning. The truth of that settled deep in my chest. I had come into his life later. I hadn't been a part of his early years. I hadn't built the history that others could claim, and suddenly I understood something that made everything else fall into place. In a story where people are fighting over what something meant, the person who came last is often the easiest one to erase. I looked at him, my voice barely above a whisper. Are you trying to protect me? He didn't hesitate. Yes. That single word changed everything. Because in that moment I realized this wasn't just about paperwork. It wasn't just about money or property or decisions. It was about truth, about memory, about who would be allowed to define what our life together had been. And for the first time, I understood why Richard had been moving so carefully, why he had involved a lawyer, why he had spoken to the pastor, why he had brought Aaron back into the picture. He wasn't just organizing his affairs. He was building something that would stand after he was gone. Something that couldn't be easily twisted. Something that could speak, even when he no longer could. The last few weeks of Richard's life felt like living inside a quiet goodbye. Not the kind people imagine, no dramatic speeches, no constant tears. It was softer than that. Slower. filled with small moments that carried more weight than anything loud ever could. By then, his strength had faded in ways we could no longer pretend were temporary. He moved carefully, spoke less, and rested more. The house, once full of his steady presence, began to revolve around what he could manage in a day. But his mind stayed clear, sometimes painfully clear. We developed a rhythm, the two of us. Mornings were for quiet conversations when his energy was strongest. We would sit at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the worn wood surface, and talk about simple things: what to cook, what we might watch later, which flowers in the yard needed tending. Afternoons were slower. He would nap, and I would move through the house in that careful way you learn when someone you love is resting, closing doors, gently placing things down without sound existing in a kind of respectful silence. Evenings were unpredictable. Some nights he felt strong enough to sit beside me on the couch. Other nights the fatigue pulled him back to bed early, and in between all of it, there were moments where he said things that felt like they were meant to stay with me long after he was gone. One evening, as I helped him settle into bed, he caught my hand before I could step away. "Stay for a minute," he said. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, brushing a hand lightly over his arm. "You've been doing that a lot lately," I said softly, "making me stay." He smiled faintly. "Just making sure I use my time wisely." My chest tightened. "You've always used your time wisely," I replied. He shook his head slightly. "Not always," he said, "but I'm trying to get it right now." There was something in his tone, something final but not hopeless. "I've been thinking," he continued. "That can be dangerous," I teased gently, trying to lighten the moment. He gave a quiet huff of amusement. "I've been thinking about what matters," he said. "What actually lasts." I didn't interrupt. People think it's the big things he went on. The business, the house, the money. But that's not what stays with people. "What does?" I asked. He looked at me, his eyes steady despite the weariness in his face. "How you made them feel," he said. "Whether they felt safe with you, whether they felt seen." My throat tightened. "You made me feel that way," he added. I swallowed hard. "And you made me feel like I didn't have to earn it," he said. "That's rare." Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them back. "I didn't do anything special," I said. "Yes, you did," he replied quietly. "You stayed." The simplicity of that nearly broke me, because staying had never felt like something remarkable. It had just felt like love. A few days later, he brought something up that shifted the weight of everything again. We were sitting in the living room, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor. He had been unusually quiet, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls of the house. "Connie," he said suddenly. "Yes, I need you to promise me something." The words felt familiar, heavy. "What is it?" I asked. He turned to face me fully. "No matter what happens at the memorial," he said, "don't argue." I frowned slightly. "Argue with who? Anyone," he said. "Especially Melissa." The name hung between us. "Why would I argue at your memorial?" I asked, confused. He held my gaze. "Because she might give you a reason to." A slow, cold realization moved through me. "You think she's going to—" "I don't know exactly what she'll do," he interrupted gently, "but I know her patterns." I felt my chest tighten. "And you want me to just stay silent?" I asked. For a little while he said, "Yes, that doesn't feel fair," I admitted. "I know," he said, "but fairness isn't always what protects you." I stared at him, trying to understand. "If she says something that isn't true," I began. He reached for my hand, then let someone else correct it, he said. My heart started to race. Someone else, I repeated. He didn't elaborate. Instead, he gave my hand a gentle squeeze. Just trust me, he said, the same words he had used before. Trust me. And because it was him, I nodded. All right, I said quietly. I promise. He relaxed slightly as if that answer had been more important than I realized. Thank you, he said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just agreed to something much bigger than I understood. The final days came faster than I was ready for. There was no dramatic moment where everything stopped, just a gradual fading. His voice softer, his movements slower, his presence thinner somehow, even when he was right in front of me. The night he passed, the house was still. Too still. I was sitting beside him, holding his hand, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breathing. It had been uneven for hours, and though no one had said it out loud, I think we both knew. I'm here, I whispered. His fingers tightened around mine just slightly. I know, he said. We didn't say much after that. Some things don't need words. When his breathing finally stilled, it didn't feel like a moment. It felt like a space opening, a silence that was too large to hold. I don't remember calling anyone. I don't remember the exact sequence of what happened next. I remember the absence and the overwhelming, aching awareness that the person who had anchored my world was no longer in it. The days that followed blurred together. Phone calls, arrangements, people coming in and out of the house with condolences that felt both kind and distant. And then, Melissa took over. Not abruptly, not aggressively, but efficiently. She stepped into the role of organizer as if it had always belonged to her. I'll handle the service details, she said. You shouldn't have to worry about that right now. It sounded thoughtful, considerate, and part of me was too exhausted to argue. So I let her. At first it seemed like a relief, but then I started noticing the changes. The obituary draft she showed me listed me as his wife, Connie Lawson. Once. At the very end, after paragraphs about his career, his achievements, his role as a father and grandfather. I read it twice, trying to understand why it felt wrong. It's beautiful, Melissa said, watching me closely. It just feels a little... I hesitated. Brief. It's standard, she replied smoothly. These things usually focus on legacy. Legacy. I swallowed. His marriage was part of his life too, I said quietly. Of course, she said. That's why you're included. Included. The word stung more than it should have. I just thought I began. Connie, she interrupted gently, her tone calm but firm. This is already very difficult for everyone. Let's not complicate things. Complicate things. I nodded slowly. All right, I said. But something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make me aware of something I hadn't fully accepted before. I wasn't just grieving, I was being repositioned, and as the days moved closer to the memorial, that feeling only grew stronger. Small decisions were made without me. Details finalized before I could weigh in. Moments where I realized I was no longer being asked, but informed. Each one subtle. Each one easy to overlook. But together, they told a story. A story where my place in Richard's life was being reduced, simplified, and quietly rewritten. And beneath it all, I could hear Richard's voice in my memory. Don't argue. Let someone else correct it. I didn't know what that meant yet. I didn't know who that someone else was. But as the day of the memorial approached, one thing became painfully clear. Whatever Richard had prepared, it was going to matter. Because I had a feeling Melissa wasn't done. Not even close. The morning of the memorial arrived too quickly. I woke before dawn, not because I was ready to face the day, but because sleep had become something shallow and unreliable. The house felt unfamiliar without Richard in it, every room holding echoes of him, every quiet space reminding me that he would never walk through it again. I stood in the bedroom for a long time, staring at the black dress hanging on the closet door. "You look steady in that one," he had said once, months earlier when we were preparing for a church event. Steady. I needed that word now more than anything. When I finally put it on, my hands trembled just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel the weight of everything waiting outside that front door. Melissa arrived early. Of course she did. She stepped inside like she had done this 100 times before, composed, efficient, already in control of the day. "You ready?" she asked. I nodded. "As much as I can be." She gave me a brief smile. "It's going to be a beautiful service," she said. "Dad would have wanted that." I didn't respond. Not because I disagreed, but because something about the way she said it felt rehearsed. Like the day had already been shaped in her mind long before it began. The drive to the church passed in silence. When we arrived, the parking lot was already filling. Familiar faces, neighbors, people from Richard's business, members of the congregation who had known him for decades. They greeted me with kindness, with sympathy, with that careful gentleness people use when they don't know what to say. "I'm so sorry, Connie. He was a good man. We're praying for you." I thanked them, smiled when I could, nodded when I couldn't, and all the while I felt something beneath it. A shift I couldn't yet explain. The sanctuary was already arranged when we walked in. White lilies at the front, soft music playing through the speakers, rows of polished wooden pews filling steadily with people. Richard's photograph stood near the pulpit. It was one I loved, him standing outside on a clear day, eyes slightly squinting in the sunlight, that quiet strength in his posture. For a moment I forgot everything else. I just stood there looking at him, remembering. Until Melissa's voice broke the silence. "Connie, they've reserved seats for family up front." Family. The word lingered. I followed her to the front row. She sat on one side of the aisle close to where the pastor would stand. I took the seat beside her, aware of the small but deliberate positioning. Even now there was an arrangement. An order. The service began softly. Pastor Samuel Brooks stepped forward, his presence steady, his voice calm as he welcomed everyone and spoke about Richard's life, about his work, his generosity, his quiet strength. I listened, holding on to each word like it might somehow keep Richard closer. There were hymns, prayers, moments of shared memory. For a while it felt right. Sad, yes. Painfully so. But respectful, dignified. Then Melissa stood. She moved to the front with the same confidence she carried into every room. Her posture straight, her expression composed, but there was something beneath it now. Something sharper. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," she began, her voice clear and practiced. "My father meant so much to so many people." She spoke beautifully. That's the truth. She talked about Richard as a father, his guidance, his work ethic, the values he had instilled in her. She painted a picture of a man who had always been present, always been strong, always been devoted to his family. People nodded. Some smiled through their tears. It was convincing. But as she continued, something began to shift. Subtle at first. I know there have been a lot of emotions these past few months, she said, her tone softening. A lot of changes, a lot of influences. The word hit me immediately. Influences. My chest tightened. Melissa paused, letting the word settle. And I think it's important, she continued, that we remember my father for who he truly was, not for the version of him that might have been, shaped in his final days. A ripple moved through the room, small, barely noticeable. But it was there. I felt it like a shift in the air. My hands went cold. She hadn't said my name, not yet, but everyone knew where she was going. Dad was a man of clarity, she went on, of independence. He made his own decisions. He wasn't someone who needed to be managed or guided by others. Each word was measured, carefully chosen. He loved his family deeply, she said. And I know without a doubt that he would want the truth to be honored today. Truth. I could barely breathe. This wasn't a tribute anymore. It was something else. Something I had been warned about but hadn't fully believed would happen. Until now. Melissa turned slightly, her gaze sweeping the room, and sometimes she said, her voice lowering just enough to draw everyone in. When people come into our lives later on, they don't always understand the full story. My heart began to pound. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room shifting, searching, waiting. I wanted to stand up, to say something, to stop it before it went any further. But Richard's voice echoed in my mind. Don't argue. I stayed seated, frozen between instinct and promise. And while I respect that everyone processes grief differently, Melissa continued, I also think it's important to be honest about what my father did and did not say in his final days. There it was. The line she had been building toward, the moment where suggestion became accusation. I felt a tremor move through me, because she said, finally turning her head just enough that her eyes landed on me. There have been things said, stories told, that simply aren't true. The room went still, completely still. And then without hesitation, without softening it or disguising it any further, she said the words that split everything open. I'm sorry, but I have to say it plainly, she said. My father did not say the things Connie Lawson claims he did. A gasp, quiet but unmistakable, moved through the sanctuary. My ears rang. I felt like the air had been pulled out of the room. He did not express those feelings. She continued, her voice unwavering. He did not make those promises, and he certainly did not intend for his life to be reinterpreted after the fact. Each sentence hit harder than the last. I could feel eyes on me now, not all of them, but enough. Confusion, curiosity, doubt. I opened my mouth to speak, to defend myself, to say something, anything that would stop this from becoming the story people remembered. But the words didn't come. Grief had already taken so much from me. And now, in front of everyone who had come to honor my husband, I felt something else being stripped away. My place, my truth, my right to even be part of the story. I'm not saying this to be cruel, Melissa added, her tone softening again, as if that made any difference. I'm saying it because my father deserves honesty. Honesty. The irony of it burned. I could feel myself slipping, not physically, but emotionally, like the ground beneath me was no longer steady. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, not to argue, not to fight, but because I couldn't sit there any longer and be erased in silence. The room watched, waiting. And for a moment I thought maybe I would speak anyway, promise or not, because some things feel too important to leave unchallenged. But before I could say a single word, before I could even take a breath, another voice cut through the silence. "Connie." It was Pastor Samuel Brooks. His voice was calm, but it carried. It stopped everything. I turned toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. He was standing at the front holding something in his hand, a sealed envelope. And when he looked at me again, there was something in his expression I hadn't seen before. Not just sympathy, not just concern, certainty. "Connie," he said again, more clearly this time. Richard knew this moment might come. The words echoed through the sanctuary, and just like that, everything changed. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the entire room had been suspended between two versions of reality, Melissa's version, still hanging in the air like a carefully placed accusation, and something else. Something none of us had yet fully seen. Pastor Samuel Brooks stepped forward, the envelope held steady in his hand. "I'm going to ask for everyone's attention," he said, his voice calm but firm, in a way that carried authority without needing to raise itself. The murmurs that had begun to ripple through the congregation fell silent. Even Melissa didn't speak. I could feel her beside me, still standing, still composed, but something in her posture had shifted. Just slightly. Just enough to tell me she hadn't expected this. Pastor Brooks looked down at the envelope, then back up at the room. Richard Lawson came to see me. Several weeks before his passing, he began. During that visit, he entrusted me with this sealed letter. He held it up just enough for everyone to see. He gave me very specific instructions, he continued. He told me that this letter was not to be opened under normal circumstances. A quiet tension settled over the room, but the pastor said, his gaze moving slowly across the congregation. He also told me that if there were ever any accusations, any disputes, or any attempt to misrepresent his final wishes or the truth of his life, I was to open this letter and read it aloud immediately. The words landed with a weight that no one could ignore. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Richard had known, not just suspected, known. Pastor Brooks paused as if giving the room a moment to absorb what had just been said. Then he turned slightly. "Connie," he said gently, meeting my eyes, "your husband anticipated that this moment might come." My hands trembled, not with fear anymore, but with something else. Something fragile rising beneath the shock. Hope. "I am going to open this letter now," the pastor said. No one objected. No one moved. The only sound in the room was the faint, deliberate tear of paper as he broke the seal. It echoed louder than it should have. He unfolded the letter, carefully smoothing it with both hands. Then he began to read. To those gathered here today, he said, his voice steady, if this letter is being read, it means something I feared might happen. Has happened. A hush fell over the room, so complete it felt like even the air was listening. I want to be very clear, the letter continued. I wrote this while I was fully aware, fully capable, and fully certain of my thoughts. I saw Margaret Ellis seated a few rows back, straighten slightly at those words. Legal clarity, intentional. First, the pastor read, "Connie Lawson is my wife." Not in name only, not in convenience, but in truth. My vision blurred. I blinked hard, trying to stay present to hear every word. She stood beside me through the most difficult chapter of my life. The letter continued. She cared for me when my strength failed. She brought me peace when I needed it most. A quiet shift moved through the congregation, subtle, but undeniable. I did not make my decisions under pressure, Pastor Brooks read on. I did not speak words I did not mean, and I did not lose clarity in my final days. Melissa's composure tightened beside me. Not broken, but strained. "If anyone claims otherwise," the letter continued, "they are mistaken." The pastor paused for just a fraction of a second, then corrected himself. "No," he said, adjusting the tone slightly as he read the next line more precisely. "They are not mistaken," he read. "They are choosing a version of events that serves them." A quiet ripple passed through the room. Not loud, but sharp, and for the first time since Melissa had spoken, I felt something shift completely. The balance, the narrative, the truth. "I understand," the letter went on, "that after I am gone, there may be confusion. There may be disagreements about what I intended, what I said, and what I valued." The pastor's voice remained steady, but I could hear something beneath it now. "Respect." He continued, "That is why I am leaving this statement to remove any doubt." I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to steady the emotions rising inside me. "Connie did not influence me," the pastor read. "She did not guide my decisions for her benefit. If anything, she encouraged me to move slowly, to consider carefully, and to keep peace where I could." A tear slipped down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. "She has been my partner in the truest sense of the word," the letter continued. "And I will not have her character questioned after I am gone." The words hit harder than anything before, because they weren't just a defense, they were a declaration. A line drawn clearly, deliberately, in a moment Richard knew he would not be present to witness. The pastor lowered the paper slightly, just enough to glance at the room. No one spoke. No one interrupted. Even Melissa remained still. But I could feel it. The change. The doubt that had begun to form when she spoke was unraveling. "Thread by thread," Pastor Brooks continued, "I loved my daughter," the letter said, "and I will always love her." The tone shifted, not softer, but more complicated. "However," he read, "love does not mean agreement, and it does not mean I ignored behaviors that concerned me." A sharper silence fell. "Over the past several years," the letter went on, "I have observed actions and attitudes that made it necessary for me to be more deliberate in how I handled my affairs." Melissa inhaled sharply beside me. It was subtle, but I heard it. This was not done out of anger, the pastor read. It was done out of responsibility. The distinction mattered. I could feel it in the way the room reacted. "I take full ownership of my decisions," the letter continued, "and I made them with care, with thought, and with a clear understanding of the consequences." The pastor's voice did not waver. He added, "If there is discomfort in hearing this, I understand, but discomfort does not change truth." I closed my eyes briefly, just for a second, because in that moment something inside me finally released. The tightness, the fear, the sense that I might be erased. It was still painful, still overwhelming, but it was no longer unbalanced, no longer one voice against another. Richard had spoken, not through memory, not through interpretation, but directly, clearly, and in a way that could not be easily twisted. Pastor Brooks lifted the paper again. "There is more," he said quietly. The room held its breath, and I realized something as I opened my eyes again. This wasn't just about defending me. This wasn't just about correcting what Melissa had said. This was something deeper, something Richard had prepared carefully, because if the first part of the letter had restored my place, the next part was about to reveal why it had ever been questioned in the first place. There is more. Pastor Brooks's words didn't just carry across the room, they settled into it. Heavy, inevitable. The kind of weight that tells you something irreversible is about to happen. I straightened slightly in my seat, my hands clasped together so tightly I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. Around me, the sanctuary had gone completely still again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not uncertain, not divided, waiting. Pastor Brooks looked down at the letter once more, then continued. "I want to speak honestly," he read, "because I have spent too many years choosing comfort over clarity." That line alone shifted something. I felt it ripple through the room. Richard had never spoken like that in public. He was a man who avoided confrontation not because he didn't see problems, but because he believed in preserving peace whenever possible. But this was something else. For a long time, the letter continued. I believed that by stepping in quietly, and by smoothing over difficulties, I was doing what a father should do. A few heads in the audience lowered, not out of shame, but recognition. I now understand that in some cases I was not helping Pastor Brooks read. I was enabling. The word struck like a bell, clear, unavoidable. I shielded my daughter from consequences, the letter continued, financially, emotionally, and in ways I did not fully acknowledge at the time. Melissa shifted beside me. Not dramatically, but enough that I felt it. This was done out of love, the letter said. But love, when misapplied, can create expectations that are difficult to undo. I heard someone behind me inhale quietly. The room was no longer just listening. It was absorbing. I say this not to condemn Pastor Brooks Reed, but to explain. He paused briefly, then continued. In recent years, I became aware of a pattern that concerned me deeply. My heart began to pound again, but not with fear, with anticipation. Questions about my affairs. The letter went on. Pressure to make decisions quickly. Suggestions that I was no longer capable of managing my own life. A murmur barely audible moved through the pews. I want to be absolutely clear, the pastor read. At no point did I lose my mental clarity. At no point was I unable to understand my decisions or their consequences. Margaret Ellis shifted again, her expression composed but firm. Documentation, confirmation, layer upon layer. Any implication otherwise, the letter continued, is not based in truth. Melissa's breathing had changed. I could hear it now, shallow, controlled. Trying to hold on to something that was slipping. I also became aware the letter went on of attempts to access information and influence decisions that were not appropriate. There it was, the line between implication and revelation. I will not detail everything here Pastor Brooks read, but I will say this. I did not make my final arrangements lightly, nor without reason. The sanctuary felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were closing in around the truth. I observed behaviors that led me to question whether my intentions would be respected after my passing, the letter continued. That is why I took the steps I did. Every word was precise, measured, deliberate. This wasn't anger. This was documentation. I did not want confusion to be used as a weapon, Pastor Brooks read. My chest tightened at that line. Because I had heard something like it before, from Richard himself, in quiet moments, when he thought I didn't fully understand. And I did not want silence to be mistaken for agreement, the letter continued. That one landed even deeper. Silence. Agreement. How many times had Richard chosen silence to keep the peace? How many times had that silence been interpreted as permission? I recognize that this may be difficult to hear, the letter said, but difficulty does not invalidate truth. The room was no longer just quiet. It was still, as if no one dared move. I loved my daughter. Pastor Brooks read again, his voice softening slightly. "And I still do." Melissa's shoulders tensed, but she didn't speak. She couldn't, because the words weren't attacking her. They were defining her. However the letter continued, "Love does not mean I ignore what I have seen." A pause. Then, "And it does not mean I allow others to rewrite my life in a way that suits them." That line cut cleanly through everything that had happened minutes earlier. Everything Melissa had said. Everything she had tried to plant in the room. I felt something inside me settle. Not completely. Not yet. But enough to breathe again. Connie Lawson did not take anything from me. Pastor Brooks read. She gave me something I had been missing for years. My vision blurred again. She gave me peace, the letter continued. She gave me steadiness. She gave me a place where I did not feel managed or evaluated. Managed. Evaluated. The contrast was not subtle. "And I will not have that dismissed," the pastor read, his voice firm. A quiet, almost imperceptible shift passed through the audience. People weren't just listening anymore. They were choosing. Choosing what they believed. Choosing what they saw. And for the first time since Melissa had stood up, I truly knew that the room was no longer hers. "I understand that grief can bring out many things in people," the letter continued. "Confusion, fear, even defensiveness." The tone softened again, but the clarity remained. "If my daughter is struggling with this moment," the pastor read, "I do not condemn her for that." That surprised me. It surprised the room too. I could feel it. Because this wasn't punishment. It wasn't revenge. It was something harder. Something more honest. "But struggle does not give anyone the right to misrepresent my life or my choices." The letter finished. The final sentence hung in the air. Unchallenged. Unavoidable. Pastor Brooks lowered the paper slowly. For a moment he didn't speak. Neither did anyone else. The silence stretched not uncomfortable this time, but full. Full of everything that had just been laid bare. I turned slightly. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to see Melissa. Her face was still composed, but it wasn't the same composure she had walked in with. This one was tighter, more fragile. The kind that comes when control starts slipping but hasn't fully broken yet. Her eyes didn't meet mine. They stayed fixed forward, as if refusing to acknowledge what had just happened would somehow undo it. But it couldn't, because Richard had done exactly what he said he would. He had removed confusion. He had spoken clearly. And he had done it in a way that didn't rely on me to defend myself. Just like he promised. I felt a hand touch my arm. Light. Steady. I turned to see Diane seated just behind me. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her expression said enough. "You're not alone." And for the first time since the service began, I believed that. Pastor Brooks stepped forward again. "There is still more to be addressed," he said gently. "More." The word sent another wave through the room, because if everything we had just heard had already shifted the ground beneath us, then whatever came next was going to finish it. And I realized something in that moment. This wasn't just about restoring my name. This wasn't just about correcting what Melissa had said. Richard hadn't written this letter to defend one moment. He had written it to tell the whole truth, even the parts no one wanted to hear, especially those. "There is still more to be addressed." Pastor Brooks's voice was steady, but the words carried a new kind of weight now. Not the shock of revelation, but the certainty that what came next would leave no room for denial. The room had changed. I could feel it in the way people were sitting, in the way they leaned forward slightly, no longer out of polite attention, but because they needed to hear the rest. Needed to understand what Richard had seen, what he had chosen, and why. Melissa stood frozen where she was, not interrupting, not moving, just holding herself together. Pastor Brooks glanced down at the letter again, then continued reading. I will not go into every detail he read because this is not the place for a full accounting. A pause. But I will say enough to make my intentions clear. The words were deliberate, controlled, measured, just like Richard had always been. I became aware the letter continued of efforts to position certain outcomes before I had made my final decisions. The phrasing was careful but unmistakable. I was approached more than once with suggestions that I simplify matters by transferring control early, Pastor Brooks read, that I make changes quickly before I had fully considered them. I felt the air shift again. Not dramatically, but enough. Because now it wasn't just about feelings, it was about actions. I did not agree the letter continued, and I did not appreciate the pressure applied. The pastor's voice didn't rise, but something in the firmness of the words made them land harder. I also noted attempts to question my clarity he read, subtle at first, then more direct. A murmur sharper this time moved through the room. I want it on record. The letter continued that I was fully aware of these conversations, and I rejected the implication that I was incapable of managing my own affairs. Margaret Ellis stood up. She didn't rush. She didn't interrupt the reading. But she stood. And when she did, every eye in the room turned toward her. Pastor Brooks paused just long enough for her presence to be acknowledged, then continued. All legal documents he read were executed with full competency, with witnesses present, and with professional oversight. Margaret nodded once. That was all. But it was enough. The confirmation wasn't emotional. It was factual. Final. I made changes where I believed they were necessary. The letter continued. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of responsibility. The distinction echoed again. Responsibility, not punishment. I needed to ensure Pastor Brooks read that what I built would not be misused, and that those I cared about would be protected appropriately. Protected. The word lingered, because now it was clear. This wasn't just about defending me. It was about safeguarding something larger. Something Richard believed was at risk. I also took steps. The letter continued to review prior records and ensure there were no irregularities in my business or personal accounts. Aaron Mitchell shifted in his seat. Then slowly he stood, not with hesitation, but with quiet certainty. Pastor Brooks didn't stop reading, but he allowed the moment to exist. I asked for assistance from someone I trusted, the letter said. Someone familiar with my business history and capable of identifying anything that might have been overlooked. Aaron inclined his head slightly. Not toward the room, toward the truth. I will not detail those findings here, Pastor Brooks read, but I will say this, my concerns were not unfounded. That line struck harder than anything before, because it didn't accuse directly, but it confirmed enough. Melissa moved. Just a step. Barely noticeable. But I felt it beside me. The shift of balance. The beginning of something slipping. I do not share this to embarrass anyone, the letter continued. I share it because clarity matters. Clarity. The word that had followed everything Richard had done in those final months. I do not want assumptions to replace facts, the pastor read, and I do not want silence to be interpreted as approval. Another echo. Another line drawn. Melissa's breathing had grown sharper now, not loud, but present. visible. I understand, the letter went on, that hearing this may be difficult for some. A pause. But discomfort is not a reason to ignore what is true. The room held steady. No one moved to defend her. No one spoke up, because there was nothing to argue with. Not anymore. Pastor Brooks lowered the paper slightly, his eyes scanning the room, not searching for reactions, but acknowledging them. Then he continued. "I have made my decisions carefully," the letter said, "and I stand by them fully." There was a finality in that sentence that closed off any remaining doubt. "I ask that those decisions be respected," he read. "Not because they are convenient, but because they are mine. Mine." That word mattered, because everything Melissa had implied, everything she had suggested, depended on the idea that Richard had not been fully in control, that someone else had shaped his choices, that his final wishes were questionable. But now, that narrative was gone. Completely. "I will not have my life reduced to a version that serves someone else's perspective," the letter continued. That line didn't just correct what had happened, it erased it. I felt something inside me settle fully for the first time since the service began. Not relief, not exactly, but stability. A sense that the ground beneath me had been restored. I turned my head slightly again. Melissa was no longer looking forward. Her gaze had dropped. Her composure, once so controlled, so intentional, was fracturing at the edges. Not dramatically, not in a way that would invite sympathy, but enough to reveal something real, loss of control, and something else beneath it, something harder to name. Pastor Brooks lifted the final page slightly. "There is one last matter I want to address," he read. The room leaned in again. Because if everything so far had shifted the balance, this would define what came next. "I have made provisions," the letter continued, "that reflect both my care and my concerns." Margaret Ellis stepped forward now, not interrupting, but ready, prepared, as if this part had been expected. "My estate has been arranged in a way that I believe is fair," Pastor Brooks read, "but also protective. Protective. Again, not equal, not divided, protected. I have ensured that Connie Lawson is provided for," the letter continued, not as an afterthought, but as my partner. My throat tightened, because even now, even after everything, Richard was still speaking for me, still placing me where I belonged. Not at the edges, not as an addition, but at the center of what we had been. "I have also made provisions for my granddaughter," the letter continued, "to ensure her future is supported, independent of outside influence." A sharper reaction moved through the room, because that meant something very specific, something very deliberate. Melissa's head lifted slightly, just enough to show she understood. "I believe in her," the letter said simply, "and I want her to have opportunities that are not shaped by the same patterns I have observed." That was it. That was the line, the one that connected everything, past, present, future. "I say all of this not to create division," Pastor Brooks read, "but to prevent misunderstanding." He lowered the paper slowly. "My hope," he finished, "is that in time, truth will bring not just clarity, but peace." The last word lingered. Peace. The thing Richard had always tried to protect. Even when it cost him something. Pastor Brooks folded the letter carefully, and in the silence that followed, something undeniable settled over the room. This wasn't a debate anymore. It wasn't a matter of perspective. It was finished. The truth had been spoken. Clearly. Completely. And for the first time since Melissa had stood up, she had nothing left to stand on. When the service finally ended, no one rushed to leave. That struck me first. Usually, after something like a memorial, people drift out slowly. Quiet conversations, soft goodbyes, the gentle unwinding of shared grief. But this time, something held everyone in place just a little longer. Not confusion, not discomfort. Something closer to recalibration. People were rethinking what they had just witnessed, reordering what they believed, and I could feel it in the way they looked at me now. Not with pity, not with uncertainty, but with something steadier. Recognition. I stayed seated for a moment after Pastor Brooks stepped down the folded letter still in his hand. My body felt heavy, like I had just walked through something I hadn't fully caught up to yet. Diane leaned forward from behind me. "You okay?" she asked softly. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if that word truly fit. "I think so," I said, but what I meant was something else. "I think I'm still standing." That felt closer to the truth. Melissa didn't move right away either. She remained near the front, her posture upright, her expression composed, but it was a different kind of composure now. Less controlled, less certain. People approached her cautiously. A few offered quiet words, others didn't. And that absence, those who chose not to engage, said just as much as anything spoken. I stood slowly, my legs steadier than I expected. For the first time since the service began, I didn't feel like I needed to rush out. Didn't feel like I had to escape. Because I wasn't the one being pushed out anymore. Margaret Ellis approached me first. She didn't offer condolences. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered something more practical. "Are you all right to talk for a moment?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She nodded, her expression calm, professional, but not distant. "Richard was very thorough," she said. "I want you to know that everything stated in that letter aligns completely with the legal documents he put in place." I took that in slowly. "So, there's no room for it to be challenged?" I asked. Her lips pressed together slightly. "There's always room for someone to try," she said. "But there is no room for them to succeed." The clarity in her voice steadied me. He ensured that his decisions were documented properly. She continued, "Witnessed, verified, supported by medical confirmation of his competency, layer upon layer, just like I had seen unfolding." "He anticipated resistance," she added. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Yes," I said quietly. "He did." Margaret's expression softened just a fraction. "He also anticipated that it might be difficult for you," she said, "which is why he structured things the way he did." I nodded, because now I understood. This wasn't just about protecting his assets. It was about protecting me. From doubt. From erasure. From being pushed aside in a story I had lived. Aaron approached next. He stood a respectful distance away at first, as if unsure whether to step closer. "Mrs. Lawson," he said. "Connie is fine," I replied. He nodded. "Connie," he said, "I just wanted to say, he trusted you, completely." The words were simple, but they mattered. "Thank you," I said. He hesitated, then added, "And for what it's worth." What he said in that letter, it lines up with what I saw too. I looked at him. "You knew I asked. Not everything," he admitted, "but enough." Enough what? Enough to know he wasn't imagining things Aaron said, and enough to know he was trying to fix something before it got worse. Fix something! The phrase stayed with me, because that's what all of this had been in a way. Not revenge, not punishment. Correction. I thanked him, and he stepped back, giving me space again. The room had begun to shift now, people moving, talking quietly, but the tone had changed. There was no longer that undercurrent of doubt, no longer that sense that something hidden was waiting to surface. It had already surfaced. Completely. I turned, scanning the room, looking for Melissa. I found her near the aisle speaking to someone I didn't recognize. Her expression was composed again, but thinner now, more fragile. She glanced up. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment everything else fell away. No audience, no pastor, no letter, just the two of us. She looked at me not with anger, not even with defiance, but with something more complicated, something unsettled, something that didn't quite know where to go next. Then she looked away. The moment broke, and I understood something then. The fight she had started in that room, it hadn't ended the way she expected, but it wasn't over either. Not completely. Outside the church, the air felt different, lighter, or maybe I was just breathing differently. Diane walked beside me as we stepped onto the front steps. "You held up better than I would have," she said. I let out a small, tired laugh. "I didn't feel like I was holding up at all," I admitted. "You did," she said firmly. "You didn't say a word, and you didn't have to." That part hit me, because she was right. For once, silence hadn't been weakness. It had been strategy, Richard's strategy. "He knew exactly what he was doing," Diane added. "Yes," I said. And this time there was no doubt in my voice. He did. We stood there for a moment watching people disperse, cars pulling out, small groups lingering, life continuing even after everything that had just happened. "Do you think she'll let it go?" Diane asked quietly. I didn't answer right away, because I already knew. "No," I said finally. Diane nodded. I didn't think so either. I looked back at the church doors, at the place where everything had shifted. "She's not done," I said. "No," Diane agreed. "But neither are you." That gave me pause, because until that moment I hadn't thought of it that way. I hadn't thought of myself as part of something ongoing. I had just been reacting, surviving. But now things were different. Because the truth was no longer hidden. It was no longer something I had to prove. It had been spoken, publicly, clearly, and backed by more than just words. Margaret joined us outside a few minutes later. "There will be a reading of the estate in the coming days," she said. "I'll contact you with the details." I nodded. "Thank you." She studied me for a moment. "Be prepared," she added. "This may not be the end of the challenge." "I understand," I said, and I did, more than I had before, because now I saw the full picture. Melissa hadn't just been grieving. She had been positioning, planning, shaping a narrative she believed would hold, and now that it had been dismantled, she would have to decide what to do next, accept it, or fight it. And something told me she wasn't the kind of person who stepped back easily. As we walked to the car, I felt something settle inside me. Not peace, not yet, but something close to it. Stability. A sense that no matter what came next, I wouldn't be facing it from a place of uncertainty anymore. Richard had made sure of that. He had spoken when I couldn't. He had protected what mattered. And now, whatever came next wouldn't be about proving the truth. It would be about what people chose to do with it. The days after the memorial didn't bring relief the way I thought they might. They brought noise. Not loud, obvious noise, but the kind that spreads quietly through conversations, phone calls, and glances that linger a second too long. The kind that doesn't knock on your door but still finds its way inside? At first it came in small ways. A neighbor who stopped by with a casserole and stayed just long enough to say, "That must have been," difficult with a look that suggested she knew more than she said. A distant cousin who called to check in, then casually mentioned hearing that things got a little tense at the service. Nothing direct, nothing confrontational, but enough to remind me that what had happened in that church didn't stay there. It had spread, and Melissa was helping it spread. Diane was the first one to tell me plainly. "She's talking," she said one afternoon, standing in my kitchen with her arms crossed like she was bracing herself for my reaction. "I assumed she would," I replied, setting down the mug I hadn't really been drinking from. "She's not repeating what happened," Diane continued. "Not exactly." "Of course not," I said, quietly. "She's reframing it," Diane said, saying the pastor overstepped, that the letter was taken out of context, that you encouraged Richard to put things in writing in a certain way. I felt something cold settle into my chest. Even after everything, even after the letter. "She's not accusing you outright," Diane added, "but she's implying enough to keep the doubt alive." I nodded slowly, because that was Melissa's strength. She didn't need to prove something. She only needed to keep it uncertain. "People don't like feeling like they were wrong," Diane said. "So if she gives them a way to question what they saw, some of them will take it." That part didn't surprise me, but it did hurt. Not because I needed everyone to believe me, but because I had hoped naively maybe that the truth being spoken so clearly would be enough. It wasn't. Not for everyone. And Melissa knew that. "She's preparing for something," Diane said. That phrase again. "Preparing, just like before." I exhaled slowly. "She's going to challenge the estate," I said. Diane didn't hesitate. "Yes." The word landed heavily, because I knew what that meant. More conversations, more scrutiny, more time spent defending something that should have already been settled. More time not grieving. Margaret Ellis called the next morning. Her tone was professional but not distant. "I wanted to speak with you before anything formal is filed," she said. "Filed?" I asked, though I already knew. "We've received notice that Melissa intends to contest aspects of Richard's estate," she confirmed. There it was, out in the open. "On what grounds?" I asked. "Capacity," Margaret said. "And influence. The same words, the same narrative. Just formalized." "She's claiming he wasn't fully capable of making those decisions," I asked. "Yes," Margaret replied, "and that external influence may have shaped them." External influence. I didn't need to ask who that meant. "What happens now?" I asked. "There will be a review process," she said. "Documentation will be examined. Witnesses may be called. It won't be immediate, but it will be thorough." I closed my eyes briefly. "I understand," I said. "And Connie," she added, her voice softening just slightly, "you should know this is not unexpected. Richard prepared for this." I let out a breath. "Yes," I said. "He did." After the call ended, I sat in the quiet of the living room looking around at the space that still felt like his chair, his books, the faint imprint of a life that had filled this house so completely. And I realized something that hadn't fully settled in yet. This wasn't over. Not emotionally, not legally, not in any sense. The memorial had been the first confrontation. The letter had been the first truth. But now, this was the continuation. Later that afternoon, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I didn't expect to see Sophie. She stood there small and uncertain, her backpack slung over one shoulder like she had come straight from school. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I replied, surprised. "Is your mom?" "She doesn't know I'm here," Sophie said quickly. That stopped me. "Okay," I said gently. "Do you want to come in?" She nodded. I stepped aside and she walked in slowly, looking around like she hadn't been in the house in a long time, even though that wasn't true. "Do you want something to drink?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, I'm okay." We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us, not uncomfortable, just fragile. "I'm sorry about Grandpa," she said finally. The words were simple, but they were real. "Thank you," I said softly. "I miss him too." She nodded, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I heard what happened," she said. "At the service," she nodded again. And after, she added, "I waited, because something told me she hadn't come here just to say that." "She's been talking about it," Sophie said quietly. "Your mom?" I asked. She nodded. She says things weren't fair," Sophie continued, "that Grandpa wasn't thinking clearly, that people took advantage." The words were careful, but they carried weight. "And what do you think?" I asked gently. She hesitated, then looked up at me. "I think Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing," she said. The certainty in her voice caught me off guard. "Why do you say that?" I asked. She shifted slightly, adjusting the strap of her backpack. "Because he talked to me," she said. My breath caught. When I asked. "Before he got really sick," she said. "He used to sit with me sometimes when Mom was busy." I felt something tighten in my chest. "What did he say?" Sophie reached into her backpack and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "He gave me this," she said. My hands trembled as I took it. It wasn't an official document. Not typed, not formal, just a piece of paper folded carefully. I opened it slowly. The handwriting was familiar. "Richards, I don't know if you'll understand all of this now," it read, "but one day you will. Always tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. And never confuse love with control. They are not the same." My vision blurred. "He said some people try to control things when they're scared," Sophie added quietly. "But that doesn't make it right." I looked at her, at this young girl who had seen more than anyone had realized. "He trusted you," I said softly. She shrugged a little. "I think he just wanted someone to hear him," she said. That broke something open in me, because that's what this had all been about. Being heard, being understood, being remembered correctly. "Can I stay for a little while?" Sophie asked. "Of course," I said. And as she sat down in the living room right there in the space where Richard had spent his final days, I realized something I hadn't fully allowed myself to feel before. This wasn't just about loss. It wasn't just about conflict. It was about what continued, what carried forward. And in that moment, sitting across from his granddaughter, holding a piece of his handwriting in my hands, I understood something with a clarity that settled deep into my bones. Richard's voice hadn't ended in that letter. It was still here, in the things he had said, in the people he had reached, in the truth he had trusted others to carry. And no matter how hard Melissa tried to reshape the story, that part could not be erased. The legal process didn't begin with a courtroom. It began with rooms that felt too small for the weight of what was being said. Conference rooms, offices, spaces designed for calm discussion but filled with tension that never quite settled. Margaret Ellis prepared me for that. "It won't be dramatic at first," she said. "It will be procedural, structured, but don't mistake that for simple." She was right. The first meeting took place in her office, A long table, neatly arranged documents, a quiet hum of air conditioning that seemed louder than it should have. Melissa arrived with her attorney. She looked exactly as she had at the memorial, composed, controlled, perfectly put together. If anything, she seemed more focused now, sharper. Grief had not softened her. It had refined her. "Connie," she said when she walked in, her tone neutral. "Melissa," I replied. No warmth, no hostility, just acknowledgement. We took our seats. Margaret began by outlining the purpose of the meeting, reviewing the estate, addressing concerns, allowing both sides to present positions before anything escalated further. Formal, measured, safe. At least on the surface. Melissa's attorney spoke first. He was calm, articulate, and precise, in a way that told me this wasn't new territory for him. "My client has concerns regarding the circumstances under which Mr. Lawson's final decisions were made," he said, "specifically his mental capacity and the potential for undue influence." The words were expected, but hearing them spoken out loud in a room where they were meant to carry weight, it still hit. Margaret didn't react immediately. She simply nodded. "All documentation has been provided," she said. "Medical evaluations, witness statements, legal verification. Mr. Lawson's capacity is not in question." Melissa's attorney leaned forward slightly. "Capacity can fluctuate," he said, "particularly under medical stress." Margaret met his gaze. "Not in this case," she replied. "The documentation is consistent across multiple points of time." A pause. Then Melissa spoke. "For the first time, my father was under a lot of pressure," she said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried something beneath it now, something sharper than before. "He was sick," she continued. "He was vulnerable, and he was surrounded by people who may not have had his best interests at heart." Her eyes flicked toward me, not openly accusing, but not hiding it either. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but this time, I didn't feel the same helplessness, because I knew what came next. Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she gestured toward the documents in front of her. "Mr. Lawson met with me multiple times," she said, "independently, without external presence. He expressed his intentions clearly and consistently." She paused. "And he also anticipated this exact line of argument. That shifted the room, just slightly." Melissa's composure didn't break, but it tightened. "He anticipated resistance," her attorney asked. "He anticipated misrepresentation," Margaret corrected. The distinction mattered. Aaron Mitchell spoke next. He hadn't said much until that point, but when he did, his voice carried a different kind of weight. Not legal, not emotional, factual. "I was asked to review certain financial records," he said, "at Mr. Lawson's request." Melissa turned toward him. "Aaron," she said, her tone controlled. "You know my father trusted me. I know he wanted to trust you," Aaron replied. The room went still. That wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't a defense either. "He also wanted clarity," Aaron continued. "And that's what I helped provide." Melissa's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Because she couldn't. Not without losing ground. The meeting continued like that point-response documentation clarification, layer by layer, until it became clear that there wasn't much room left for interpretation. Not in the legal sense, but that didn't mean the emotional part was finished. It never is. The meeting ended without resolution, not formally, but with something close to it. Melissa's attorney stated they would review everything and consider next steps. Margaret nodded, professional, unshaken. But I could feel it. The shift. The slow realization that the path Melissa had chosen was narrowing. Outside the office, the air felt different again. Cooler. Quieter. Melissa was waiting near the entrance, alone. Her attorney had stepped away, giving her space, or maybe giving her time. "Connie," she said. I stopped. Not out of obligation, but because something in her voice was different, less controlled, less certain. "What is it?" I asked. She took a step closer, not aggressively, but deliberately. "I need to understand something," she said. I didn't answer right away. I just waited. "Why did he do this?" she asked. The question wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't sharp. It was real. For the first time, there was no performance in it. Just confusion, pain, and something else beneath it. Fear. "What do you mean?" I asked gently. Her expression tightened. "Why would he leave things the way he did?" she said. "Why would he trust you? More than me?" There it was. Not money, not control. Something deeper. I took a slow breath. "He didn't trust me more than you," I said. She let out a short, bitter laugh. "That's not what it looks like. That's not what it was," I replied. She shook her head. "Kershaw, then explain it," she said. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he replaced me." The words hung there, heavy, loaded. And for a moment I saw it clearly. Not the version of Melissa that stood in the church, not the one who controlled the room, but the one underneath, the one who had spent years measuring herself against something she didn't fully understand. "He didn't replace you," I said quietly. Her eyes locked onto mine. "Then what?" she asked. "He stopped trying to protect you from yourself," I said. The words came out softer than I expected, but they landed. Hard. Her expression shifted. Not into anger, not immediately, into something else. Something raw. "That's not fair," she said. "No," I agreed. "It's not." A silence stretched between us. "But it's true," I added. She looked away. Just for a second, then back again. "You think you understand him better than I do?" she asked. "No," I said. "I understand what he needed at the end." That stopped her. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means he needed peace," I said. "Not pressure, not negotiation, not someone trying to manage the outcome before it happened." Her shoulders tensed. "I wasn't managing him," she said. "You were trying to control what came after," I replied. The truth of it hung there. Unavoidable. "I was trying to make sure things were handled properly," she said. "For who?" I asked. The question wasn't cruel, but it was direct. And she didn't answer. Because she couldn't. Not honestly. We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything settling between us. "I didn't think he would go this far," she said finally. That line stayed with me, not because of what it meant for the estate, but because of what it revealed. She had expected resistance, but not consequences. "He didn't want to," I said. Her eyes flicked back to mine. "Then why did he?" she asked. "Because he finally saw what was happening," I said, "and he knew what would happen if he didn't. That was the part she hadn't accounted for, the part none of us had fully understood until it was too late." Melissa exhaled slowly, her composure returning but not fully, not like before. "I don't know what to do with this," she admitted. And that was the most honest thing she had said. "You don't have to decide everything right now," I said. She looked at me, something uncertain in her gaze. "Don't I?" she asked. "No," I said gently. "You just have to decide what you're going to do next." That was the truth of it. Not the past, not the letter, not even the estate. The next step. That's what would define everything now. She didn't respond. She just stood there for a moment longer, then nodded. Once. Small. Barely visible. And turned away. Watching her walk back toward the parking lot, I realized something I hadn't expected. This wasn't the moment she changed. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't resolution. But it was something else. The moment where the truth had reached her. Whether she accepted it, that was still to come. But for the first time, she had heard it. And this time, there was no one left to rewrite it. The weeks after that conversation with Melissa moved differently. Not easier, but quieter. The kind of quiet that comes after something has been said out loud and can't be taken back. Margaret called a few days later to confirm what we had already begun to understand. "They're not moving forward with the challenge," she said. I sat in the same chair Richard used to sit in, the phone pressed gently to my ear. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "They've reviewed the documentation, and without a stronger basis, it would not hold." I closed my eyes for a moment. Not in relief. Not exactly. More like release. A tension I hadn't realized I was still carrying slowly loosened its grip. "Thank you," I said quietly. "You don't need to thank me," Margaret replied. "Richard did the work." She was right. He had done all of it, even the parts I didn't see until it mattered most. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time. The house felt different again. Not empty the way it had the night he passed. Not heavy the way it had been after the memorial. Just still. Like it was waiting to become something new. I didn't rush that feeling. I let it sit. Because for the first time in a long while, nothing was pressing in on me. No accusations, no explanations, no need to defend what had already been proven. Just space. And in that space, something unexpected began to grow. Not happiness. Not yet. But the possibility of it. I started going back to the library a few mornings a week. Not because I had to, but because I needed something familiar. Something that reminded me of who I had been before everything became about illness and conflict. The smell of books, the quiet conversations, the simple act of helping someone find what they were looking for. It grounded me, in a way nothing else had. Diane noticed the change almost immediately. "You're standing differently," she said one afternoon as we sat together on my back porch. "What does that mean?" I asked, smiling faintly. "It means you're not bracing yourself anymore," she said. I thought about that and realized she was right. For so long I had been preparing for something, waiting for the next moment where I would have to explain, defend, or endure. But now, there was no next attack, at least not one waiting just around the corner. "She hasn't called," Diane added carefully. I knew who she meant. "No," I said. "And you're okay with that?" she asked. I considered the question. "I don't know yet," I admitted, because the truth was more complicated than a simple answer. I didn't miss the conflict, but I also didn't pretend everything had been resolved. Some things don't resolve. They just settle into whatever shape they can. Sophie continued to visit, more often now, not in secret, not with hesitation, just openly. She would come after school sometimes with homework, sometimes just to sit and talk. She asked questions about Richard, not the grand ones, not the kind people ask at memorials. but the small ones. What was his favorite movie? Did he always drink his coffee black? What made him laugh the most? Those were the moments that mattered, because they weren't about what had been fought over. They were about what remained. One afternoon, as we sat at the kitchen table, she looked at me thoughtfully. "Did he leave you anything else?" she asked. I tilted my head slightly. "What do you mean?" "Like letters," she said. "Or things he wanted you to read later." The question stirred something in me, because I remembered. The box. Pastor Brooks had mentioned it briefly after the service, but everything had been too overwhelming at the time to focus on it. "He did," I said slowly. Sophie's eyes lit up slightly. "Have you opened it?" I shook my head. "No, not yet." "Why not?" I smiled faintly. "I think I've been waiting until everything else settled first." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Can I be here when you do?" she asked. The question surprised me, but not in a way that felt wrong. "Yes," I said. "I think he would like that." We went to the study together. The box was exactly where Pastor Brooks had left it on the shelf near Richard's desk, untouched. I hadn't moved it, hadn't even opened it, until now. My hands felt steady as I lifted it down, not because it wasn't emotional, but because something inside me had changed. I wasn't afraid of what was inside. Not anymore. Sophie sat quietly across from me as I opened the lid. Inside, there were 3 envelopes, each one labeled in Richard's handwriting. Connie, Sophie, and Melissa. I felt my breath catch for a moment. Of course. He had thought of all of us, even at the end, even after everything. I picked up the one with my name first. It felt right. Sophie watched silently as I opened it. The paper inside was simple, unfolded, familiar. I began to read. "Connie, it started. If you're reading this, it means you've made it through the part I was most worried about." A small, unexpected smile touched my lips. That sounded like him. I wish I could be there to make it easier. The letter continued, "But I trust that you are stronger than you believe." My throat tightened. "Thank you for staying," he wrote. "Thank you for choosing me, even when it wasn't always simple." I closed my eyes for a moment, because those words, they carried everything we had been. You gave me peace in a time when I didn't think I could find it again. The letter continued, "And I hope in time you find that same peace for yourself." A tear slipped down my cheek. Quiet. Unforced. "I don't want you to carry anger forward," he wrote. "Not for my sake. Not for yours." That part hit deeper, because anger would have been easier, cleaner, more straightforward. But he wasn't asking for that. Healing isn't the same as forgetting, the letter continued, and forgiveness isn't the same as going back to what was. I let out a slow breath, because that was the truth I had been trying to find words for. "I trust you to know the difference," he wrote. I lowered the paper slightly. Sophie was watching me carefully. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes," I said softly. "I think..." I folded the letter gently and placed it back in the envelope. Then I looked at the other 2. "Do you want to read yours?" I asked. She nodded. Carefully, almost reverently, I handed it to her. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the page as she read. At first, her expression didn't change. Then something softened, just slightly. "He says he's proud of me," she said quietly. My heart tightened. "Of course he is," I replied. She smiled faintly, a real smile, not forced, not uncertain, just there. We didn't open Melissa's letter. Not that day. Not because it didn't matter, but because it wasn't ours to read. Some things have to wait for the person they belong to. As we sat there, the late afternoon light stretching across the room, I realized something that hadn't fully settled in until that moment. Richard hadn't just prepared for conflict. He had prepared for what came after it, the quiet, the rebuilding, the healing. And he had left us each something different, not to divide us, but to guide us. Whether we followed it, that was still up to us, but the path was there, clear, unmistakable. And for the first time since everything began, I felt ready to walk it. The first real sign that something had changed didn't come with an apology. It came with silence. Not the heavy silence that had followed the memorial. Not the strained silence of unspoken tension. A different kind. One that didn't press against me. One that simply existed. Weeks passed. Then a month. Life slowly and carefully began to take shape again. I found a rhythm. Mornings at the library where the world still made sense in quiet ways. Afternoons tending to the house, learning how to live in it without feeling like I was just waiting for something else to happen. Evenings were the hardest. They always are. That's when memories settle in. Not the dramatic ones, the small ones. The way Richard used to clear his throat before speaking. The way he always checked the doors twice at night, even when he knew they were locked. The way he would pause mid-sentence, smile, and say, "Now where was I?" as if the thought mattered less than the moment. I missed that. I missed him. But the grief had changed. It wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't tearing through me without warning. It had softened into something quieter. Something that didn't disappear but didn't consume me either. Sophie continued to visit, more regularly now. Her presence had become something steady, comforting in a way that didn't feel like a replacement but a continuation. One afternoon we were in the backyard, kneeling in the soil planting white camellias. Richard's favorite. He had once told me they reminded him that something delicate could still be strong. I held that thought as I pressed the roots gently into the earth. "Do you think he would like this?" Sophie asked, brushing dirt from her hands. "I know he would," I said. She nodded, satisfied with that answer. We worked in silence for a while. Not awkward, just shared. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. This was what remained. Not the arguments, not the accusations, not the conflict, but the quiet ways people choose to carry someone forward. Later that evening, after Sophie had gone home, I found the envelope again, the one labeled Melissa. It sat exactly where I had left it, untouched, waiting. I didn't open it. It wasn't mine to open. But I couldn't ignore it anymore either, because now everything else had settled. The legal challenges had faded. The noise had quieted. The truth had been spoken. What remained was choice. And that choice didn't belong to me. 2 days later, the letter came. Not from a lawyer, not from a formal address, just a simple envelope. My name written in handwriting I recognized immediately. I stood in the doorway for a moment holding it, feeling the weight of something unfinished. Then I opened it. "Connie," it began. No formalities, no distance. Just my name. "I've read his letter." That was the first line. And somehow it told me everything. "I didn't want to," she wrote. "But I did. I could almost hear her voice in the words, measured, careful, still trying to hold on to control, but no longer fully able to. He was clearer than I expected, she continued, and more honest than I was ready for. I sat down slowly, the paper steady in my hands. I don't agree with everything he said, she wrote, but I can't pretend I didn't hear it. That line mattered. Not agreement, acknowledgement. I've spent a long time believing that if I stayed in control of things, everything would turn out the way it was supposed to, she wrote. A pause in the sentence, as if she had rewritten it more than once. I don't think that worked the way I thought it would. I let out a slow breath, because that was the closest thing to truth she had offered yet. I'm not going to challenge anything else, she wrote. I don't have the energy for it, and I don't think he would have wanted that. Another shift, not surrender, but something close. I don't know what happens next, she admitted. Neither did I, but I kept reading. I know I said things at the service that I shouldn't have, she wrote. The words weren't dramatic, they weren't emotional, but they were real. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she added. I don't think it works like that. No, it doesn't. I just wanted to say that I understand more now than I did then, she wrote. I read that line twice, because it was the one that mattered most, not apology, understanding. It wasn't complete. It wasn't perfect. But it was something. At the bottom, she had signed her name. Just Melissa. No love. No attempt to soften it. Just truth. I folded the letter carefully and set it down, not with finality, but with acceptance, because this wasn't an ending. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a moment where everything was suddenly fixed. It was something quieter, more realistic, a door that had been closed, not fully opened, but no longer locked. I didn't rush to respond. I didn't feel the need to. Some things don't require immediate answers. Some things just need time to exist. That night I sat in the backyard again. The camellias were still small, fragile, but rooted. And as I looked at them, something settled inside me in a way that hadn't happened before. Not because everything was resolved, but because I no longer needed it to be. The truth had been spoken. My place had been restored. Not by argument, not by force, but by something stronger. By someone who had known what mattered enough to protect it, even after he was gone. And in that quiet moment, I understood something that stayed with me long after the sun had set. That day in the church, the day Melissa stood up and tried to rewrite everything, it could have been the moment I disappeared, the moment I lost my voice, my place, my truth. But it wasn't. Because before any of that could happen, before doubt could take root, before silence could be mistaken for weakness, Richard had already done something I hadn't fully understood until now. He made sure that when it mattered most, someone would stand up, someone would speak, and someone would say my name. Not to question it, not to challenge it, but to restore it. And from that moment on, I stopped asking for permission to belong in the life I had lived, because I already knew the truth, and now, so did everyone else. There are moments in life when grief is not the only thing we carry. Sometimes we carry doubt. We carry judgment. We carry the weight of other people trying to tell our story for us. And in those moments, it's easy to feel small, to feel like your voice doesn't matter, like your truth can be rewritten if someone speaks loudly enough. But what I learned is this: the truth doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it arrives later than we want. But when it comes clearly, when it's spoken with intention, with care, and with courage, it has a way of restoring what was almost lost. Love is not proven by control. It's not measured by who holds power or who speaks first. It's shown in presence, in honesty, in the quiet ways we stand beside someone even when no one is watching. And forgiveness. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's not pretending something didn't happen. It's choosing not to let that moment define the rest of your life. Sometimes we don't get perfect endings. Sometimes we don't get full apologies. But we can still find peace. We can still stand in our truth. And we can still choose what we carry forward. If you've ever felt misunderstood, judged, or erased in your own story, I'd really like to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in my place that day? Do you believe forgiveness always means reconciliation? Share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. If this story meant something to you, please like and subscribe. You never know who might need to hear a story like this today.